My name is Nick Smith, and I am the Associate Pastor of Students here at Deep Creek. Cliff already said it, but if you're a guest this morning and you're visiting with us, we're glad you're here. And it's my honor and privilege this morning to be able to open God's Word with you. And so we're going to jump right in, but I want to set it up first with a little bit of personal experience. Now, I don't know about you, but I love the way it feels outside this morning. Anybody with me? It's a little chilly, but that's spring for you. Like, that's what spring is supposed to be. That chilly in the morning and warms throughout the day and then kind of chilly again at night. I love it. But I think the biggest reason why I love it is because it's like a trigger for me that triggers a memory from my childhood. And that memory specifically is opening day of baseball season. I played baseball all throughout from T-ball through high school. And it was those spring mornings that opening day always seemed, you know how we've had like days that have been in the 80s recently, and then we go down in the 50s, and then it's back to the 80s, and then a 70 day, and then back to the 80s. Well, it's like that all the time when I was a kid too. But then opening day came, and it was like 50 degrees, and it was cold, but we had to be out there early in the morning on the field for all the opening day ceremonies. And we had to be wearing our uniforms, which meant that we were cold. And we couldn't wear a coat because you weren't supposed to cover up your team uniform. Everybody had to be a team together. And so I can remember those days on the baseball field. And I didn't realize it as much then as I do now, but I loved just the feeling of that spring bring of newness and the new season bring of new opportunities and hopefully more playing time and all this kind of stuff. But I was excited about it. And so when I wake up in the morning and it's chilly outside and the day warms, it reminds me of those days of opening day. Now, it's been 15 years since I played baseball competitively. And now, those spring temperatures kind of harken to a newer thing for me. The last couple years, I've been a part of the men's softball team for church. So, yeah, that's right. And we begin, just shameless plug here, we begin April, I think it's 11th, the week of April 11th, so it's the 14th. So come on out, support us, we'd love to have you. But anyway, now I'm in the season of life, a transition, 15 years in between baseball, now softball. And the curious thing to me is that even though our softball league is a pretty low stakes league, like there's not much we're playing for. The only thing we really have is as a team, we have a pact that if you strike out, you have to buy the team cookout milkshakes. Yeah, I know, right? So we're secretly praying for a strikeout. But it's also tougher to strike out when the ball's coming in like this. But it happens. And so that's really all the stakes there. Otherwise, it's for fun. It's for playing together. And it's for a chance just to get out there and play some sort of baseball again. But I still find every now and then that the feelings I had when I was playing baseball in high school kind of creep back into who I am at the plate and who I am in the field when I'm playing softball. And specifically, I go back to a memory when I was in high school, when I was 15, of a state championship game. And that whole tournament, I had started third base for my team. And the whole tournament, I played flawlessly. The whole tournament, I made no mistakes in the field. State championship game comes. We're neck and neck with this team. I committed my first error. And the ball, I just boofed it. I should have caught it. Should have been an easy out. Took my mind off the ball. Let it go through my legs. That runner that got on base ended up scoring, and the team we were playing against went up 1-0. So it comes to the bottom of the seventh, which was the bottom of the ninth, the end. And I had the fortunate opportunity to come up to bat, which I loved all the time. And still down 1-0. There was no runners on, but I still felt the pressure. I had made the error that cost us the run that put the team up. And it was up to me now to do something about it. And I'd like to tell you that this was a hero story. But it's not. I grounded out. My team lost the game. We lost the championship. And while I knew that a lot more goes into losing a baseball game than just 2 plays and a bat and a missed catch, I felt like the reason why we lost was all on me. And sometimes when I'm playing softball, I feel that pressure of the past kind of build up. And that idea that I have something to prove, that I failed in the past and now I have something to prove. And the goofy thing is that circumstances are completely different. When I was in high school, I weighed $140. I was 5'10". I was one of the fastest people on my team. I was a great base runner, pretty good third baseman. I hit for base hits, and I love to run the bases. 15 years later, still 5'10", not 140. And because of that, I'm no longer the fastest person on my team. In fact, my teammates can attest to the fact that not the fastest at all. And because of that, I'm no longer the greatest base runner. But now I've found that I can actually hit for power, mostly because gravity is on my side. But circumstances are completely different. But yet I still find that one thing rings true. One thing translates. And that's that my feeling of inadequacy, my feeling of failures in the past can come, and I project that onto my present, even in softball. But here's the application I want to make this morning. Because I think all of us in here have the tendency to do this in life in general. And that is take what's happened in our past, those feelings of inadequacy, those failures, and project them onto our present. And we allow those things to begin to define who we are now, define how we characterize ourselves, how we interact with others, how we allow others to see us, and really how we treat other people. All of that to say, last week we celebrated the power of Jesus' resurrection. And the resurrection is everything our past isn't. Because the resurrection takes our past and wipes it out completely. Because of the new life that Jesus brings with resurrection, he wipes out everything that we've done in the past. So we no longer have to worry about characterizing ourselves by who we used to be, by our failures, by our shortcomings. And yet, some of you in here this morning may have had the roughest week of your life, or at least in a long time. Some of you may this week have dealt with feelings of insecurity, feelings of what would have happened, what if I had done this in the past? What if I hadn't made this mistake? Some of you in here this morning, this week, struggled with who you were and allowed who you were to kind of be superimposed on who you are now. And if you're not careful, what you can begin to do is start seeing yourself from the past. But the resurrection isn't that. And so this morning, I'd like to give you a little bit of hope. Because whether you know it or not, you have a whole lot in common with a very prominent biblical character. And not just a character, I hate using that word because it makes it sound like fiction. Prominent biblical historical person. And that is Peter. The very guy who, when Jesus ascended back into heaven, literally left in charge of the church on earth. So let's jump into it together. We're going to be looking in John chapter 21. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there with me. It'll also be on the screen. We're going to begin in verse 1. We're going to read for a little while, and then we're going to jump toward the end of the passage. And I'll be reading from the NLT, and it reads as follows. John chapter 21. Later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." "We'll come too," they all said. So they went out into the boat, but they caught nothing all that night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. Then he said, "Throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll get some." So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Now we're going to pause and fast forward here a little bit. But to fill it in, Peter doesn't even realize that it's Jesus on the shore yet, still clueless. John points out that it's Jesus, so Peter, being Peter, who always is impetuous and jumps to do whatever he feels, jumps out of the boat into the water and swims to the shore so he can be first to meet Jesus. They all have breakfast on the beach. Jesus cooks some fish over the fire. And then it says in verse 15, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. "You know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. And a third time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question the third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, "Follow me." But because Peter's so awesome, we're not done yet. Peter turned around and saw behind them the disciple Jesus loved, the one who had leaned over to Jesus during supper and asked, "Lord, who will betray you?" That disciple is John. And Peter asked Jesus, "What about him, Lord?" Jesus replied, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? As for you, follow me." Now, there's a lot going on in this passage. But I don't want to miss one thing from the beginning, which is that at this point, when this happens in the life of Peter and the others, the resurrection has already happened. Okay, Jesus has already come back from the dead. And at least twice, maybe more, we have instances of Jesus appearing to Peter and the others. So several times now, Jesus has appeared to his disciples, his followers, and spent time with them, and they know that he's alive. So all of the fear and anxiety and doubt and despair, everything that would have come with Jesus dying and his followers being just totally at a loss because everything they thought he was supposed to be was not going to be anymore because he was dead, because they misunderstood him. All of those feelings, all of that feeling of not knowing what to do had been overcome. And so Jesus now had been before them physically. He had been with them physically, and they knew he was alive. So you would think that means that from there on, and we're talking right here in this passage, at most a couple of weeks after Jesus rose from the dead, at most, maybe even days. You would think that they would be to the point of like on top of the world, Jesus is alive, woohoo, like, and going about their lives like this is awesome. But that's not where we find Peter. And see, in these instances where Jesus appears to the disciples, we have something curious happen. It's always kind of bothered me. And that is that every time he appears to them after he's resurrected, they don't recognize him at first. And I've kind of wrestled through this, and I don't want to get sidetracked. Because there's many, many books filled with theological discussions and ideas and theories as to why they didn't recognize him. But really what it comes down to is it's just a theory because we don't really know. And it may be that Jesus because Jesus was in his new body that maybe, he was Jesus, so he's the resurrected God now. He has any ability that he could ever want or exercise, so he could do whatever he wanted to. And it may be that he just masked himself so they didn't really know who he was. And then he lifted it, and they knew who he was. But I think there's a little bit more at play here. And I think it comes to life in this passage. Because in this passage we see that, and I think this might be a reason why they don't recognize Jesus when he comes to them, is because the disciples were focused too much on who they used to be and not on who Jesus had become. In this passage, John says that Peter turns to the others and he says, I'm going fishing. Now, we have any fishermen in here? Anyone? I know there's some. This is not that kind of fishing. Peter's not like, guys, grab your poles, we're going to go cast out a few, have a cold drink, enjoy ourselves on our day off. That's not what this is. They go and they dust off all their old equipment because Peter was a commercial fisherman. And to our knowledge, the equipment that they used on this day, unless they borrowed it, if it was their own, hadn't been used in quite a while. It's been 3 years since Peter and the others began to follow Jesus full time, all the time. So they hadn't been fishers. And here, after the resurrection, after Jesus comes back from the dead, we have Peter saying, I'm going fishing. And the others are like, well, I guess we'll come too. Now, I don't know, and I can't speak for Peter. I don't know what he was feeling in the moment when he said, I'm going fishing. I don't know if it was just desperation. I don't know if it was frustration. I don't know if it was just because he was bored. And just as a side note, how many times in your life have you made decisions that turned out to be stupid ones? Out of boredom or out of frustration, out of fear, out of desperation, that you made those decisions not based on what Jesus has done new in your life, but who you were. I don't know about you, but when I make those stupid decisions, it's never because I'm living in the newness of Jesus. It's because I've allowed the old Nick, my inadequacies, my failures from the past, color who I am and allow me to make those decisions based off of who I was and not who I am. So Peter and the others decide they're going to fish, which is telltale that they're identifying themselves as the old people, not who Jesus has made them to be new because of the resurrection. And it's interesting to me that all night and all morning they fish and they catch nothing. And it wasn't until Jesus told them what to do that they succeeded at all. See, Peter had faced Jesus' death, and he reacted. And he reacted by denying that he ever knew Jesus at all. Peter faced Jesus' resurrection, and he reacted. But at this point, when we see Peter, it's a confusing Peter that we see. I think it's interesting that Peter and the others were failing completely. Where they were fishing was probably full of fish. I kind of have to think that Jesus was messing with them a little bit. And so they failed until Jesus stepped in and told them what to do. Now, after this happens and after they eat breakfast with Jesus, Jesus and Peter have this conversation. And in that conversation, what Jesus does is he forgives Peter for denying him. And then Jesus restores Peter to who he's supposed to be. Now, I want to focus on something I think that's really important. And sometimes we overlook this. But I think it's an awesome thing to see that in this passage, the writer is John. Now, I think it's really cool that God uses language that we understand to communicate his truths to us. And it's not a mistake that the writers of these passages used the words that they used to communicate what they were trying to communicate. And a lot of times if we just flippantly read it, I think we miss the power of what's going on here. Because God took these people that were writing these passages and he directed them to communicate his truth. And so in the language in this passage, we see a huge truth. And so I want to point it out, because what we see is that in the beginning of this chapter, John uses a phrase to identify Peter. He calls him Simon Peter. Now, Simon was Peter's old name. Peter is the new name that Jesus gave him. As we go further and Jesus and Peter are talking, we see Jesus refer to Peter as something else. Not Simon Peter, not Peter, but Simon, his old name. In fact, he even qualifies it with Simon, son of John. So he's taking it back to, his original family, where he came from, the core of who he was, Simon. And 3 times, Jesus addresses Peter this way, Simon, son of John. Now, I don't know if any of you have nicknames. I have a nickname. It's really original. It's Nick. My name is Nicholas, of course. And I can't really remember a time where my parents or anyone called me that. In fact, if my parents ever called me that, I knew to run and hide, because it wasn't a good thing. And so now, even when someone calls me Nicholas, I'm like, wait a minute, who are you and what do you want? Because that's not my name. It's a nickname, but it's also what I go by. Now, many of us do a really good job of giving people that we care about, that we love, nicknames. And they can be based on really anything. They can be based on just a stupid moment that they had. They did something really dumb, but they'll never live it down, and that's now their name. You know anybody like that? Are you that person? If you are, sorry. But they could just be, a physical feature or just some pet name that sticks or whatever. But that's not what this is here. Okay? When Jesus named Peter, Peter, it wasn't like, well, that's a good nickname I think I'll choose for him, and it sounds better than Simon anyway, so we'll just run with it. It was intentional. It was on purpose. It was because Jesus was taking the old person Simon, he was making him new Peter, and he had an ultimate plan for Peter. In fact, that ultimate plan tied into his name, and the meaning of it, was that Peter was going to be the foundation that Jesus used to carry out the church after he left earth. And don't mean to have a spoiler alert here, but that's what happens. But the Peter we see now is not that Peter. In fact, he's not Peter at all. He's Simon. And Jesus calls him on it 3 times. It's not a mistake that he called him Simon. Jesus was pulling at Peter's heart in many, many different ways. He's forgiving him for how he betrayed Jesus. But at the same time, he's saying to Peter, you're not acting like Peter. You're acting like Simon, the fisherman, the failure. And I love Peter because he's faced with all this from Jesus. And you think he would be crumpled on the floor in a puddle of tears because of what just had happened. But also having a sense of hope and joy because Jesus had now restored him, forgiven him. And what does Peter do? This is why I love Peter, because he reminds me of myself and he gives me hope. He makes a bonehead move, and instead of addressing Jesus as, I'm sorry, Lord, he looks behind him and he sees John, the writer of this passage, and he's like, because Jesus predicts that Peter's going to die, really he's predicting, and church tradition confirms, that Peter would die by crucifixion, that he would follow in the steps of Jesus that way. And so Jesus is predicting how Peter is going to die. And Peter's like, wait a minute, what about him? You didn't say anything about him. And Jesus kind of, again, verbally to Peter, he's like, don't worry about him. If I want him to live forever until I come back, what's that to you? But he says, follow me. And I think it's interesting too that John uses Peter to refer to Peter, not Simon Peter after this point, not Simon, but he says Peter in reference to Peter. Because what John is setting up is this evolution of Peter coming to grips with the fact that Jesus has made him new and he no longer is defined by who he was. Now he's defined by who Jesus is. And as this passage closes, we don't have resolution to this. It doesn't end happily. But if we fast forward into the book of Acts, we see only weeks later, Peter goes from this guy who's just decided he's going to go back to fishing to the leader of the entire church standing up in Jerusalem, probably the very place that Jesus stood before he was taken and executed, and proclaims the truth of Jesus to thousands of people and leads the church from Jerusalem out into the rest of the world. And the Peter that does that is not Simon. He's not the fisherman. He's the new creation that Jesus made when he rose from the dead, and he brought new life. Jesus broke through the failure. Jesus broke through the betrayer. Jesus broke through all of Peter's failures and made him new again. And I think this is really cool too, because we're not done with Peter's failed fishing excursion. And it's not a coincidence that these things unfolded the way they did and that the story unfolds the way it does. Because this is not also the first time that this has happened to Peter. And this is important for our story of Peter's failed fishing trip. Because 3 years before this, roughly, we have Peter out on a fishing boat, having fished all night and all morning, having hung it up, and Jesus comes up to him and is like, hey, put your stuff back in your boat, put it out there in deep water again, throw your nets over. And Peter's like, well, we spent all night doing that and we caught nothing. But whatever you say, I'll do it. And so they did it. And they hauled in so many fish that the boat began to sink. And we have this account of Peter and Jesus when they get back to shore. In Luke chapter 5, verse 8, it says, when Simon Peter realized what had happened, he fell to his knees before Jesus and said, "O Lord, please leave me. I'm such a sinful man." Jesus replied to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will be fishing for people." And as soon as they landed, they left everything and they followed him. Here, 3 years later, after Jesus has risen from the dead, the same thing happens to Peter. And Jesus addresses where Peter's hope and faith was and is and where it should be, which is not in Simon, which is not in fishing, but it's in the new life that Jesus brings. And so maybe you found yourself this week faced with the power of the resurrection, but slipping back into your inadequacies and your failures. And this morning, you need to trust Jesus. Trust in the new life that he's breathed into you and live a new person. There's going to be just a word video that's going to be playing in the background. But I want to bring it home on this point. And that is that Jesus wants to take your inadequacies and he wants to push them past adequate. He wants to make you extraordinary. But it's because he wants to replace you with him. If you find that you're being haunted by your past failures, and if you find that all too often that's what characterizes where you are right now, then you need to give those things to Jesus.